My name is Margaret Calloway, and I need you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because what my daughter did to me is something I still have trouble saying out loud, even now. I'm 63 years old. I built my business from nothing, the way most people in this country do, not with inheritance or luck, but with early mornings and late nights, and a stubbornness my late husband always called my best and worst quality. By the time everything fell apart, I was running a chain of 4 physiotherapy and wellness clinics across the Greater Toronto area, with a 5th location in Ottawa that had just opened. The company was worth somewhere around $9 million. Not a fortune by Bay Street standards, maybe, but it was mine, every dollar of it. I raised my daughter, Claire, mostly alone. Her father, Patrick, passed away from a sudden cardiac event when Claire was 19 and her brother Daniel was 16. Patrick and I had built the first clinic together. He handled the operations side while I managed the clinical and financial end. When he died, I had 2 grieving children, a business that needed a full-time captain, and a mortgage on our house in Oakville that didn't care about any of that. I kept going because I had no other choice, and because stopping felt like a second kind of dying. Claire grew up watching me work. I thought she admired it. I thought she understood what it cost. She was 34 when she came to me and asked to join the business formally. She had a kinesiology degree from Western and had spent 6 years working at a clinic in Mississauga. She was good at her job. I won't take that from her. I was proud of her. I brought her on as director of clinical operations across all 4 Toronto locations, gave her a salary that was more than fair, and began quietly thinking about succession, about what it would mean to hand something I'd built to someone who carried my blood. Her husband, Richard, I had never fully trusted. That's the honest truth, and I'm not going to dress it up. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, smooth at dinner parties, good at remembering names, always saying the right thing just slightly too quickly. He worked in commercial real estate and had a habit of talking about deals he was about to close, rather than deals he had closed. Claire loved him completely. I kept my doubts to myself, because that is what mothers do. The trouble started slowly. It always does. About 8 months after Claire joined the company, I began noticing small things. A supplier invoice that had been renegotiated without my knowledge, at worse terms than what we had before. A senior physiotherapist at the Etobicoke location who resigned suddenly and wouldn't tell me why. A meeting with our accountant, Gerald Foss, a man I had trusted for 11 years, that Claire attended in my place because I had a minor procedure on my knee that week, a meeting I had explicitly said to reschedule. I asked Claire about each of these things. She had answers for all of them. She always had answers. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't understand, until I was sitting in a provincial detention centre 16 months later with nothing but time, was that Richard had been studying our company structure for over a year. He had identified something I never thought to protect against, my own trust in my daughter. In Ontario, when you bring a family member into a privately held corporation and grant them signing authority as a director, you create an exposure. It's not a loophole, it's just reality. Richard found a financial advisor, a man named Paul Devereaux, who specialized in what I can only describe as asset repositioning for difficult family situations. That's how Devereaux described it himself later in court. Asset repositioning. The plan was this. Claire would gradually move the company's retained earnings into a numbered holding company that she and Richard had incorporated without my knowledge, a shelf company registered in Alberta, with a name that was deliberately similar to one of my own legal entities. Month by month, quarter by quarter, slowly enough that it wouldn't trigger an audit flag, slowly enough that I might not notice until it was too late. I noticed in January. I was reviewing the year-end statements with Gerald, or I thought I was reviewing them with Gerald. What I didn't know was that Gerald had been given a consulting retainer by Richard's real estate firm 3 months earlier, a retainer that had nothing to do with real estate. I found the holding company by accident. I was searching through our corporate registry records for an unrelated reason. We were renewing our liability insurance, and I needed the certificate of incorporation for the Ottawa clinic, and I came across a filing that used our company's trade name in a way that didn't make sense. I called our corporate lawyer, a woman named Susan Park, from my car in the parking garage of the Young Street Clinic. I remember the exact moment. It was a Thursday. There was a film of ice on the windshield from the night before that I hadn't fully scraped. Susan pulled the records while I sat on hold. When she came back on the line, she was very careful with her words. She said, "Margaret, I think you need to come in tomorrow morning, and I think you should not discuss this with anyone in the company until we've spoken." I knew then, not the details, but I knew. I did not go home and confront Claire. I want you to understand that, because it matters. I had learned something from watching too many people make that mistake. In business, in life. You do not announce your next move to the person who is moving against you. I went home, I made dinner, I called Daniel in Vancouver and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important, and I went to bed and I did not sleep. The next morning I met with Susan. She laid it out plainly. Approximately $340,000 had been moved into the holding company over 11 months. Given the velocity of the transfers and the structure Richard had used, Susan estimated the total exposure, if the plan had continued undetected, could have reached closer to $1.2 million within another year. There was also a secondary piece, a shareholder dilution mechanism, that had been quietly drafted into a set of corporate resolutions Claire had asked me to sign in October, buried in a stack of routine documents during a period when I was dealing with a difficult staffing situation. If those resolutions had been filed, and they hadn't been, not yet, my ownership stake in my own company would have dropped below 50%. I want you to comment the city you're watching from, because what happened next is something I think about differently, depending on where a person lives, and I'd love to know where you are as I tell you this. Susan and I spent 3 days preparing. We engaged a forensic accountant named Dr. Helen Tran, who worked quickly and documented everything, the transfer records, the incorporation dates, the timing relative to Gerald's retainer. We contacted the Ontario Securities Commission. We prepared a formal complaint to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit. And then Claire called me. She called on a Sunday evening and said she needed to come by, that there was something she and Richard wanted to discuss with me about the company's future direction. Her voice had a quality I recognized from when she was a teenager and had already decided something. Not asking, just notifying. I told her Tuesday would work. I told her to come at 7. I spent Monday on the phone with Susan, finalizing the documentation package. I spent Monday night sitting in Patrick's old chair in the study, looking at a photograph of Claire at age 8 in a canoe at our cottage near Huntsville, and I allowed myself to feel what I needed to feel. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I stopped, because I had work to do. What I did not anticipate, and this is the thing that undid me, temporarily, was that they moved first. Richard had someone watching. I don't know who. A contact at the corporate registry, possibly, or someone who noticed the forensic accountant's firm pulling our financial records. Whatever the source, they knew I was building a case. And so 48 hours before I was going to file, Claire walked into the Oakville Police Service and made a report. She told them I had physically assaulted her. She said that during an argument at the Etobicoke Clinic 3 weeks earlier, I had grabbed her by the arm, thrown a ceramic mug at her, and struck her across the face with an open hand. She had photographs, bruising on her forearm, a small cut near her cheekbone. Richard had taken the photographs, she said, the day after the incident. 2 clinic staff members, she said, had witnessed the altercation. None of it happened. Not 1 second of it. The officers who came to my door were professional and apologetic in that specific way that police are when they are doing something they are not entirely comfortable with. They said they had to take the complaints seriously. They said I needed to come with them. My assets were frozen within 36 hours of my arrest. Richard had already filed an emergency civil application, and because the fraud investigation I'd been building was now entangled with a criminal allegation against me, everything became complicated in ways that Susan had to explain to me 3 times before I fully understood. On paper, I had a company worth $9 million. In practice, I could not access a single account. I was assigned a duty counsel for my bail hearing. A young man named Garrett who had been practicing for 2 years and was doing his absolute best under difficult circumstances. I want to be clear that none of what happened was his fault. I was granted bail, but the conditions were severe. I could not enter any of my clinic locations. I could not contact any employees. I could not contact Claire or Richard, which under the circumstances was the only condition that felt like any kind of relief. The criminal proceedings moved the way criminal proceedings move in this province, slowly, with continuances and scheduling conflicts and a preliminary inquiry that consumed 4 months. Claire appeared in court looking composed and sad in a way that I recognized as performance, though I understood why no one else in that room would see it the way I did. Richard sat in the gallery on the days he came, and he watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who is confident about the outcome. I had 16 months. That is what I had. I want to tell you what 16 months of wrongful legal proceedings does to a person. Not the legal part, but the personal part. My son Daniel flew in from Vancouver within a week of my arrest and never fully left. He slept on my couch for 2 months, driving me to meetings with Susan, making dinner, not asking me questions I couldn't answer yet. He is the quieter of my 2 children, always has been, and during those 16 months he showed me a kind of steady, wordless loyalty that I will never be able to repay. The Ottawa clinic had to close. I didn't have the management capacity to keep it running remotely under the bail conditions, and the staff there deserved better than what I could give them. 15 people lost jobs that weren't theirs to lose. That still sits with me. I filed my RCMP complaint from a coffee shop on Bloor Street using a laptop Daniel had brought me 11 days after my arrest. Susan had updated the documentation to include the sequence of events surrounding Claire's complaint. The timing, the corporate registry access, the pattern. Dr. Martha Tram filed her forensic report at the same time. And then I waited. I learned, in that waiting, what it means to actually trust a process rather than just saying you trust it. Most of us go through life believing in institutions in the abstract, in courts, in regulatory bodies, in the idea that documentation matters. Sitting in my kitchen in Oakville at 62 years old, unable to walk into the business I had spent 23 years building, I had to find out whether I actually believed any of it, or whether I had just never been tested. The 2 staff members who had allegedly witnessed the altercation were interviewed by police 4 months in. One of them, a receptionist who had worked at the Etobicoke clinic for 6 years, gave a statement that directly contradicted Claire's account. She said she had been present that day, that there had been no altercation, and that she had been approached by Richard before the police complaint was filed and asked to confirm a version of events that she had declined to confirm. The second witness gave a statement that was vague and inconsistent, and when pressed, admitted she had not actually seen what Claire described. Claire's medical photographs were examined by a forensic imaging specialist. The analysis indicated the bruising patterns were inconsistent with the mechanism of injury Claire had described, and the metadata on the photographs themselves raised questions about when they had actually been taken. The preliminary inquiry concluded in my favor. The Crown stayed the charges. 3 weeks later, the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit executed search warrants on Richard's office and on the holding company's registered address in Alberta. I was sitting with Daniel at our kitchen table when Susan called. She said, "Margaret, I think you should open a bottle of something good tonight." I had a 2019 Tours Pinot Noir from Niagara that I had been saving for my company's 25th anniversary. Daniel and I opened it that evening, and we sat at the table and we didn't say very much, and the wine was exactly as good as I had hoped it would be. The civil proceedings took another 14 months. I won't walk you through all of it, partly because some of it is still subject to conditions I have to respect, and partly because the legal mechanics are genuinely less interesting than what they produced. The financial transfers were confirmed. The holding company was unwound. The $340,000 was recovered with interest and folded back into the company accounts. The dilution resolutions that Claire had attempted to have filed were declared void. Richard was charged with fraud over $5,000 and breach of trust. Gerald Fox surrendered his designation with CPA Ontario and reached a settlement with our company that I am not able to discuss publicly, but that I will say I found appropriate. Claire was not criminally charged in connection with the financial fraud. The threshold for establishing her intent independently of Richard's was not met, according to the Crown. I have feelings about that which I will keep to myself. What I will tell you is this. I gave Claire the opportunity to walk away from the company, from the civil action, and from any further proceedings, in exchange for a full accounting of what she knew and when she knew it. She took that offer. What she told me in a meeting that lasted 3 hours with both our lawyers present in a boardroom on King Street West on a grey Wednesday in November is something I have not shared with anyone except Daniel, and I don't intend to. What I will share is what I understand now that I didn't understand when this started. I built something for my family. I told myself that for 23 years that I was building it for them, that every early morning and every difficult quarter and every staff meeting I had on Christmas Eve was an act of love toward the people I loved most. And that was true, but somewhere in that story, I had confused building something for someone with building something with someone. Claire grew up in the shadow of something that was mine, and I never asked her, not really, how that felt. I'm not saying that excuses a single thing she did. It doesn't. What she and Richard did was calculated and cruel, and it cost me more than money. But I am 63 years old, and I have been wrong about things before, and I intend to keep being honest about that. The Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough clinics are operating. We brought on a new director of operations, a woman who came to us from a rehabilitation network in Calgary, and who, frankly, is better at the job than Claire was. The Ottawa location is still closed. I am not sure yet whether I will reopen it. Daniel is back in Vancouver. We talk every Sunday. Last month, he told me that watching what happened to me made him think differently about what he wants to build in his own life, and that he has started talking to a financial advisor about structuring his photography business properly. I told him that was the best thing I'd heard in 2 years. I don't know where Claire is. I have heard, through someone we both used to know, that she and Richard have separated. I don't know whether I believe that, or whether it matters to me. Some mornings I think about her at 8 years old in that canoe on the lake near Huntsville, and I let myself miss that person for a moment. Then I get up and go to work. That is my story, and the company is still mine. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the day the charges were stayed, not the day the forensic report landed on Susan's desk, not even the evening Daniel and I opened that bottle of Tours Pinot Noir at the kitchen table. The moment I keep returning to is a Thursday afternoon in a parking garage on Yonge Street, sitting in my car with ice still on the windshield, waiting on hold, already knowing before Susan said a word what she was going to tell me. That moment taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. I had spent 23 years believing that love was enough of a protection, that if I worked hard enough, built something real enough, gave generously enough, the people closest to me would be safe to trust completely. I confused love with immunity, and that confusion nearly cost me everything. What Richard understood, and what I had to learn the hard way, is that trust without discernment isn't a virtue. It's a vulnerability. I don't say that cynically. I say it as a woman who still believes in people, who still thinks most of us are trying to do right by each other. But there is a difference between being open-hearted and being willfully blind. I had seen the signs with Richard for years. I kept my doubts to myself because I told myself that was the kind thing to do. It wasn't kind. It was avoidance, dressed up as generosity. The thing that actually saved me wasn't luck. It wasn't even Susan, as brilliant as she was, or Dr. Darf, Tram's forensic work, or the receptionist at the Etobicoke clinic, who told the truth when she could have easily said nothing. What saved me was the discipline to not react when every part of me wanted to not call Claire the night I found that filing, to not walk into the office the next morning and confront Richard. I had one move and I could not waste it, and I knew that only because I had spent decades making decisions under pressure and learning, slowly, expensively, that the clearest thinking happens when the loudest emotions are sitting down and waiting their turn. That's what I'd want anyone watching this to carry with them. Not a lesson about family, exactly, though there's plenty of that here too. More something about the relationship between how you think and what survives. The people who came after me were counting on me to be reactive. They had built their entire plan around my predictability. When I wasn't predictable, the plan failed. I'm not a perfect person. I made real mistakes with Claire. Real ones. Not the ones she invented for a police report. I built a life that left her standing in the shadow of something that was mine before it was ever hers, and I never asked her honestly how that felt. I have to live with that. Cause and consequence don't wait for you to be ready, and they don't care whether the original wound was intentional. But here is what I know now, at 63, sitting in a company that is still mine. Integrity is not just about being honest with other people. It's about being honest with yourself, early enough that it still matters. It's about having the courage to see clearly when clarity is uncomfortable, and the endurance to keep going when the process is slow and the outcome is uncertain, and everyone around you is waiting to see whether you'll hold. I held. The company is still mine, and I'm still here.